Alexander, step away from the mail and keep your hands where I can see them.
You're looking at paperwork you don't even understand.
Alexander Eastman operated without meaningful oversight for years as a nurse practitioner across Rhode Island, New York, and Florida. Thousands of patients were listed in his files. Not one of them was ever actually seen.
This office exists to receive insurance payments.
The billing system is far more complicated than you think.
No patients, just checks.
That's your interpretation.
He would not get to finish that sentence. Within 72 hours, federal agents from 3 different agencies would seize his computer, his prescription records, the keys to a Florida home he bought in cash, and the lease to an office in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, that had never seen a single patient walk through its door. 8 insurance companies, 7 tax identification numbers, $11,923,686.30, and 1 office that existed for the sole purpose of catching the checks. Quick question before we go any further. When was the last time you actually read the explanation of benefits your insurance company mailed you? Be honest in the comments. Most people throw them straight in the trash without looking. That is exactly the silence this man counted on for years. Drop your answer below and hit subscribe if you have not already. We cover cases the mainstream press walks right past, and the next one in this story gets worse the further in you go. Alexander Andreevich Istomin was born in Leningrad in 1965, when the city still had that name, and the Soviet Union still had 9 years left at its current borders. His father was a hospital orderly at a state polyclinic on Vasilyevsky Island. His mother worked as a bookkeeper for a textile cooperative. He grew up in a 2-room apartment on Sredny Prospect, sharing a folding bed with his younger sister and a kitchen with another family on the same floor. The Istomins were not poor by Soviet standards. They were not rich either. They were the kind of family that watched what their neighbors had and kept their own ambitions quiet. From an early age, Alexander showed an aptitude for what his Russian school records described as applied arithmetic and the natural sciences. By his teens, he was reading Western medical journals translated and circulated through an unofficial channel his father maintained at the polyclinic. He decided, at 15, that he would become a physician, not a researcher, not an academic, a practitioner, someone who saw patients and wrote prescriptions and was paid in something other than the soft currency his parents had spent their lives chasing. In 1989, with the Soviet Union beginning its slow institutional collapse, Istomin was 24 years old and working as a feldsher, a kind of mid-level medical practitioner, positioned somewhere between a nurse and a doctor, at a clinic in the Petrogradsky district. He had completed 3 years of medical training in Leningrad, but had not finished the full physician's curriculum. When the borders opened, he saw what so many in his generation saw. He saw a door. In 1992, on the strength of a sponsorship arranged through a Russian-American medical exchange program operating out of New York, Alexander Istomin landed at John F. Kennedy International Airport with 2 suitcases, a folder of Russian credentials, and $300 American his mother had hidden in the lining of his coat. He spent his first 6 months in Brooklyn, working as a nursing aide at a long-term care facility in Brighton Beach, earning $7.25 an hour. He shared a 1-bedroom apartment on Coney Island Avenue with 3 other Russian immigrants, 2 of them also former medical workers from Leningrad. He sent money home every month. He studied English at night using cassette tapes borrowed from the public library. And he began the long, expensive, and bureaucratically punishing process of getting his foreign credentials recognized in the United States. The American system did not accept his Russian feldsher training as equivalent to a physician's license. He would have to start nearly from scratch. He chose nursing as his bridge. In 1995, he enrolled in an associate degree program in nursing at a community college in Queens. He worked the overnight shift at the same Brighton Beach long-term care facility to pay for it. His grades were strong. His clinical evaluations described him as meticulous, unusually composed under pressure, and a quick study in pharmacology. In 1998, Alexander Istomin became a registered nurse in the state of New York. He was 33 years old. He had spent 6 years cleaning up after dying men in Brighton Beach to earn a credential that in his home country he had effectively held a decade earlier. He did not complain about it. Friends from that period later described him as a man who absorbed insult the way concrete absorbs rain. He simply waited for it to dry and then walked on. He took his first registered nursing job at a private cardiology practice on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The pay was modest by city standards. The exposure was not. He spent 4 years there watching how a successful private practice actually ran. He watched how the doctors billed. He watched how the office manager submitted claims. He watched how the insurance companies paid. He watched what was checked. He watched what was not. By the time he left in 2002 to pursue a master's degree at a nursing program in Providence, Rhode Island, he had developed a working knowledge of medical insurance billing that, his later attorneys would argue, no nurse needed and few possessed. He completed his nurse practitioner credential in 2005 at the age of 40. He was now legally permitted to diagnose certain conditions, manage patient care, and, critically for what would come later, bill federal and private insurers directly for the services he provided. He took a position at a primary care clinic in Cranston, Rhode Island. Within 2 years, he had opened a small independent practice of his own, just outside Providence, offering general adult primary care and what he described on his marketing materials as specialty consultations for the Russian-speaking community. His evaluations from that period were uniformly positive, patient-focused, detail-oriented, demonstrates a thorough understanding of billing and coding procedures. That last one would come to mean something different than the supervisor who wrote it had intended. To understand what Alexander Eastman did, you have to understand what American healthcare insurance billing is actually built on. It is not built on verification. It is built on trust. Specifically, it is built on the assumption that when a licensed provider submits a claim stating that a patient was seen in person at a specific location on a specific date for a specific service, that visit actually happened. Every commercial insurance company in the United States, along with Medicare and Medicaid, processes tens of millions of claims every single day. The volume is so enormous that no human being reviews the vast majority of them. The claims are processed by automated systems that check for basic flags. Is the provider licensed? Is the patient enrolled? Is the billing code valid for the diagnosis code? Is the geographic location of service plausible for the provider's registered address? If those boxes get checked, the payment goes out, in most cases within 14 to 30 days. The system audits a small percentage of claims after the fact. It pulls samples. It looks for outliers. It cross-references high-volume billers against statistical norms in their specialty. But the front end of the system, the part that decides whether to release the money in the first place, runs on the foundational assumption that a claim represents a real event, a real patient, a real visit, a real conversation in a real room with a real provider, holding a real stethoscope. Providers are issued a National Provider Identifier, a 10-digit number that follows them across their career. They can also register additional tax identification numbers, called TINs, for different business entities they operate. A solo nurse practitioner running one practice typically has one. A nurse practitioner running multiple legal business entities, perhaps a primary care office, a separate consulting LLC, and a billing services company, can legitimately have several. The system allows for it. The system does not require any of those tax identification numbers to be tied to a verifiable physical location where actual patient care is delivered. It only requires an address on file for the payment to be mailed to. That address can be a clinic. It can be a home office. It can be a private mailbox at a strip mall. The system does not know the difference. The system does not check. The system trusts. This is the vulnerability that Alexander Eastman spent 15 years studying, first from the inside of legitimate practices in Manhattan and Cranston, then from his own modestly successful practice outside Providence. He understood the system better than the people running it. He understood, In particular, that the system's only real safeguard against a provider billing for visits that never happened was the patients themselves. The patients received explanation of benefit statements in the mail. Those statements listed every claim filed in their name. If a patient saw a claim for a visit they did not attend, the patient could call the insurance company and report it. That single phone call, multiplied across thousands of patients, was the entire fraud prevention layer at the consumer end of the system. Isteman's central insight was disarmingly simple. If you could make sure the patients never made that phone call, the system would never know. And there were several ways to make sure they never made that phone call. The scheme began by federal investigators' best reconstruction, sometime in 2014. Isteman was 49 years old. He had been operating his small primary care practice in Rhode Island for nearly 9 years. He had a stable income. He had a mortgage on a comfortable house in North Kingstown. He had 2 cars, neither of them expensive. He had a Russian wife and 1 son finishing high school. He had, by every external measure, achieved exactly what he had walked off that plane at JFK in 1992, hoping to achieve. And yet, the first fraudulent claims investigators were able to definitively identify in his billing records were submitted in February of 2014 under his own primary tax identification number to a Rhode Island-based commercial insurer. The visits he claimed to have provided were standard office visits at low to moderate complexity, billed at between $120 and $240 each. The patients existed. They were real human beings enrolled in the plan. They had, at some point in the previous 2 years, been actual patients of Isteman's. But the visits he billed for in February of 2014 had not happened. The patients had not come in. He had simply opened his billing software, selected their names from his existing patient list, entered a date, entered a code, and submitted the claim. The insurance company paid within 21 days. No question was asked. No follow-up was made. Isteman escalated slowly at first. A handful of false claims a month became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. By 2016, he was supplementing his real practice income with fraudulent billings that averaged tens of thousands of dollars per month. He was also expanding the architecture of the scheme. He registered new business entities. He obtained new tax identification numbers. He set up separate billing channels for each one. Investigators would eventually count 7 different TINs used to submit claims tied to him, his practice, or his name. In 2017, he leased a small office suite in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, at a quiet professional building off Main Street. He listed the address on insurance enrollment forms as a satellite location of his practice. He told the building's property manager he was a medical consultant who would be there occasionally to receive mail and meet with the occasional client. He paid the rent on time every month, in full, by check, for years. No patient was ever seen there. There was no examining room. There was no scale. There was no blood pressure cuff. There was a desk. There was a chair. There was a mailbox in the lobby with his name on it. The address existed for one reason, and one reason only. It was where the insurance companies sent the checks. By 2018, the scheme had matured into something the investigators would later describe as industrially organized. Isteman had developed a pattern. He selected patients from his real practice rosters, whose insurance plans he understood, whose co-payment behavior he could predict, and whose actual office visits were infrequent enough that a billing record showing additional visits would not stand out to the patient themselves. He cycled the names. He varied the dates. He varied the procedure codes to avoid triggering specialty-specific audit thresholds. He also began billing across state lines. Investigators would document fraudulent claims tied to addresses in Rhode Island, New York, and Florida. He had begun spending significant time in Florida by 2018. He had purchased a vacation property in Palm Beach County. By 2019, he had upgraded that property to a single-family home in a gated community, paid in cash, listed in property records at just over $1 million. The cars in the driveway included a late-model luxury SUV and a European sports sedan. The neighbors, when later interviewed, described him as polite, distant, and away from home for long stretches. The Medicare patients required a slightly different approach. Medicare patients pay a copayment for office visits. That copayment, however small, is a touch point with the system. It generates a paper trail at the patient's end. It triggers them to look at the bill. So, Istomin did something specific, and something specifically illegal under federal law. He waived the copayments. For selected Medicare patients whose names he was using to generate fraudulent claims, he simply never billed the copay. He told them, when the question came up, that he was waiving it as a courtesy. He told them not to worry about it. He told them that the insurance was taking care of everything. What he understood, and what the patients did not, was that copayment waivers to Medicare beneficiaries are prohibited specifically because they remove the patient's incentive to scrutinize the bills they receive. A patient who never pays a copay never wonders why the explanation of benefits statement lists 11 visits when they only remember 2. They simply file the paperwork away. In parallel with the fraudulent visit billing, Istomin had developed a second revenue stream that ran alongside the first. He used his nurse practitioner prescribing authority to write prescriptions in the names of his patients, and then directed the filled prescriptions, sometimes through specific pharmacies he had cultivated relationships with, to third parties who paid him for the drugs. The medications varied. Some were controlled substances. Some were expensive specialty drugs covered generously by the patient's insurance. He was, in effect, monetizing his patients twice. Once by billing for visits he never provided. Once by writing prescriptions, in their names, for drugs they never received. The entire enterprise required only one thing to keep functioning. It required the patients to keep not noticing. There are several ways federal investigations of healthcare fraud begin. They can start with a whistleblower. They can start with a routine audit. They can start with a single complaint from a patient or a former employee. In Alexander Istomin's case, the investigation began the way the largest and most quietly persistent healthcare fraud cases usually begin. It began with data. Sometime in 2019, statistical analysts working with the Office of Inspector General at the United States Department of Health and Human Services flagged Istomin's primary tax identification number for an outlier billing pattern. The flag was not dramatic. It did not involve any single claim that looked obviously false. It involved a longitudinal pattern. The number of patient visits being billed under his identifier had grown at a rate significantly faster than the underlying patient panel he had registered. His geographic distribution of services was unusual for a Rhode Island primary care provider, and his billing volume across multiple tax identification numbers, when cross-referenced, suggested a degree of administrative activity that did not match a small independent practice. The flag was forwarded to a fraud unit. The fraud unit pulled his complete claims history. The history triggered additional questions. The questions triggered subpoenas. The subpoenas pulled in records from 8 insurers. By the spring of 2020, the case had been jointly opened with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Food and Drug Administration's Office of Criminal Investigations, because the prescription diversion component of the scheme had become apparent. The investigation moved quietly. Federal healthcare fraud investigations almost always do. Istomin continued to bill. He continued to lease the East Greenwich office. He continued to write prescriptions. He continued to travel between Rhode Island and Florida, and periodically to Russia. He had no idea anyone was watching. The investigators began their work by doing the one thing the automated insurance billing system never did. They contacted the patients. They started with a small sample. They called 20 patients whose names appeared on claims Istomin had submitted in the previous 12 months. They asked the patients a single question. Did you see Alexander Istomin at his office on the date listed? The results were the kind of result that ends careers and begins prison sentences. Out of the first 20 patients contacted, fewer than half had any memory of having seen Istomin at all in the relevant period. Of those who did, some had been seen on different dates than the dates billed. 3 were able to provide passport stamps proving they had been physically outside the United States on the dates of their claimed visits. 1 had been in Greece on a cruise. One had been visiting family in the Dominican Republic. One had been in Israel for her grandson's bar mitzvah. The investigators expanded the sample. They pulled travel records. They pulled border crossing data. They matched it against the billing dates. The pattern was unmistakable. Istomin had been billing for in-person visits with patients on dates when those patients were demonstrably, documentably in other countries. And then the investigators did one more thing. They looked at Istomin's own travel. They pulled his border crossings. They cross-referenced them against the dates on his claims. On dozens of occasions, the patient he had supposedly been seeing in person at a Rhode Island office had been in another country. On dozens of other occasions, the patient had been in Rhode Island, but Istomin himself had been in Florida. On several occasions, both the patient and Istomin had been outside the United States, on separate continents, on the day he claimed to have examined them. The centerpiece of the investigation, however, was the East Greenwich office. Investigators interviewed the building's property manager. They interviewed neighboring tenants. They reviewed the building's keycard access logs and parking records. They put surveillance on the address. What they confirmed was straightforward and devastating. The office had no patients. It had no schedule. It had no examination equipment. It had a mailbox. It had a desk. It had a chair. It had Alexander Istomin's name on the door and an enrollment record on file with 8 insurance companies as a place where medical services were provided. It was, in every meaningful operational sense, an empty room that received checks. With the data established, the investigation moved into its physical phase. In late 2021, federal agents began executing search warrants. They served warrants at Istomin's primary residence in Rhode Island. They served warrants at the East Greenwich office. They served warrants at his Florida home in Palm Beach County. They served warrants on pharmacies he had used. They served warrants on his bank. The paper trail was extensive and damning. Investigators recovered patient billing rosters annotated in Istomin's handwriting with codes that bore no relationship to medical documentation. They recovered copies of explanation of benefit statements that Istomin had collected from cooperating pharmacies as proof that drugs had been filled. They recovered prescription records showing controlled substances and specialty medications written for patients who, when interviewed, said they had never received the medications, and in some cases had never been prescribed anything by Istomin in their lives. The financial picture, when assembled, told its own story. Investigators traced the proceeds of the fraudulent billings into accounts in Istomin's name and in the names of the various business entities he had set up. They traced the proceeds into the cash purchase of the Palm Beach County property. They traced the proceeds into the purchase of multiple vehicles, including the luxury SUV and the sports sedan. They traced wire transfers between his domestic accounts and accounts in Russia. The total amount of fraudulent payments processed through the scheme, when finally tallied across all 8 insurers and all 7 tax identification numbers, came to $11,923,686.30, down to the cents. Investigators also discovered, during the course of building the case, that this was not the first time Alexander Istomin had been on the radar of healthcare fraud regulators. Earlier allegations, civil in nature, had touched on his billing practices years earlier. Those allegations had not produced criminal charges. They had not stopped him. If anything, they had taught him where the lines of scrutiny were drawn and how to operate just outside them. The interviews with patients produced some of the most striking material in the case file. One Medicare patient, an elderly woman in Cranston, told investigators that Istomin had treated her with great courtesy over the years and had always told her not to worry about the copayments. "He said I had been through enough in my life," she told investigators. "He said the insurance would handle it." When investigators showed her the list of claims billed in her name over a 3-year period, she counted out loud. She had been to his office, by her count, 4 times. The list showed 31 visits. Another patient, a man in his 50s who spoke primarily Russian, told investigators through an interpreter that he had stopped going to Istomin's practice in 2016 after relocating to New Jersey. The billing record showed continuous visits in his name through 2020. He had not set foot in Rhode Island in 4 years. He had not authorized the visits. He had not received the prescriptions billed in his name. He had no idea any of it had happened. We are heading into the legal proceedings now. Before we do, if you have made it this far into this story, that is because the case earned your attention. Subscribe if you have not already. We do this every week. We do not let cases like this disappear into the back pages where the people who built them want them to stay. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in early 2022 at Isteman's primary residence outside Providence. He was at home. He had returned from Florida the previous weekend. He was at the kitchen table with a cup of black tea and an open laptop when federal agents arrived at the door with a warrant. There were 6 agents, 2 from HHS-OIG, 2 from the FBI, 2 from the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. The lead agent identified himself, presented the warrant, and asked Isteman to step away from the laptop. "You are Alexander Isteman." "I am." "We have a warrant to search this residence and to seize materials related to a federal investigation into your billing practices. We would also like to speak with you." Isteman stood. He was a tall man, lean, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind